Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Juan?
Well, the Census Bureau's latest report shows that the numbers of Americans living in poverty and without health insurance have skyrocketed. 43.6 million people, about 1 in 7, lived below the poverty level of $22,000 for a family of 4 in 2009, pushing the national poverty rate to a 15-year high of 14.3%. Meanwhile, the number of uninsured Americans grew from 46.3 million people in 2008 to 50.7 million last year. The proportion of Americans with employer-based health coverage reached its lowest rate in 20 years, nearly 56%.
Many commentators have noted these numbers point to an all but disappearing American middle class, but few people are talking about the working class and the role of the labor movement, whether in this country or elsewhere. Well, that's the subject of an award-winning British journalist's work. His name is Paul Mason. His book is Live Working or Die Fighting: How the Working Class Went Global. It's just out here in the United States. Paul Mason's the economics editor for BBC Newsnight and appears on BBC America. He's also the author of Meltdown: The End of the Age of Greed. Paul Mason, it's great to have you in New York right before you go back to Britain. You've been traveling for 2 weeks right now through the United States. Talk about the middle class.
It's disappearing. For us, the Brits, the concept of the American middle class has always been a bit flaky. We noticed that your politicians call people who earn salaries and workers at election time, and then middle class when things are going, a little bit south in terms of the economy. The figures you've just read out are borne out by the income statistics. We had the Census Bureau telling us that American average incomes have stagnated for a decade, on some measures stagnated for 30 years. We know what filled the gap: credit. The credit boom is over. And I think for many Americans I've met on this trip, the economic collapse of their lives. I met a couple who'd gone from £75,000 a year to £14,000 a year. I said to them, do you still feel middle class? They said, kind of, but we're not sure what that means anymore. To me, as a journalist looking from the outside, that's going to have big impacts on the sociology of America and eventually on its politics.
Well, I was struck in your book where you basically go head-on against a myth that's been spread quite a bit, especially in Europe and the United States, the deindustrialization of the modern world. And in fact, you say that the opposite is true, that in fact there are more industrial workers than ever before. It's just that they're not in necessarily the United States or Germany or England.
I think that the number one fact that history will record about the 3 decades we've lived through is the doubling of the world's workforce, the great doubling, as one Harvard academic calls it. Now, this has huge implications. I've had the privilege to report on this. You were speaking about contractors earlier, Iraqi contractors earlier on. I went to Lima, Peru, and found some of the people who'd been working in the green zone, dumped back in Lima with life-changing injuries, no insurance. They're part of the global working class. But, just as the stories in history didn't get reported in that way, they're not being reported in that way now. I think the story of global labour is one of the most important things we're living through, and certainly is something that everybody should own. It shouldn't be the property of archivists and activists, because these are great human stories of individual bravery and triumph over adversity. I just wanted to retell them to people who just have no other way of knowing what their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did.
Paul Mason, we were just in London, where you're going back to, and we interviewed the great spy writer John le Carré, and we're going to play that in the next few weeks. You begin your book in the community, often called a slum in Kenya, Kibera, where, well, people may know it in the United States only as the place or the backdrop of The Constant Gardener, John le Carré's book. But why did you start in Kenya, in Kibera?
Because I've reported from that shanty town, that slum, the self-organised community, as they would prefer to call it, many times. But it always occurs to me that we see it as a poverty story, and of course the struggles in those streets are about avoiding your shack being bulldozed by some hoodlum. But just 1 mile away is the Kenyan Industrial District, and every morning at 5 a.m. those people go out of the slums and into the factories. We don't see them them as workers. And yet, without those people living in the slums, earning, by the way, much less than a Chinese worker could earn, our green beans in Europe and our fresh tulips would not appear. It's a hidden story, and they need to know, I think, just as the people here in Lower Manhattan on your streets, they're having trouble with the geography of the place they live. Recent migrants, they don't know the history that Irish and Jewish migrants before them fought exactly the same battles, and how they won, and what it did to them as people, and how it raised them up as people. I just think that we're almost living in a sort of Groundhog Day where workforces keep repeating and reliving, just as the people in Kenya are reliving what my great-great-grandfathers actually went through, the first phase of industrialization. I'm from an industrial town in northern Britain.
The impact of the new centers of the working class in the world being China, India, Mexico, these other countries now where labor organization is a lot more difficult because the government is so, in most of these places, in essence, controlling even the unions that develop. What is it doing to labor consciousness, to solidarity between labor organizations around the world?
Well, above all, I think China is the absolute pivot of what's going to happen in the world. I've managed to track the emergence of the Chinese labor movement. When I first started to go to China, migrant laborers, the most oppressed people, were just happy to be living in a dormitory. To be honest, you interview a young woman who gets her first pair of high-heel pointy shoes. That is not, she doesn't see it as a tragedy that she has to live in a dormitory and work 12, 14 hours a day. But now, 5 years on, it's not just the fact that the militancy is there. I've spoken to some of the people who organise these Chinese strikes. You know how they organise them? I said, how do you organise a strike? A woman said to me, you write on a piece of paper the size of a postage stamp, the single Chinese character, strike, and then you pass it to the next person on the line. She looked at me, gone out, as that there might be a difficulty organising a strike. It's easy because they see the gap between what they're promised and what they're getting. So we are in a tremendously rapid development of a labour movement in China. Now, don't think that this is a labour movement that is going to bring down the Communist Party. The Communist Party has done something very clever. It has depoliticised labour disputes so that these strikes we had this summer in Foshan with Honda, in the Foxconn, the suicide bids, it became political, but it doesn't become insurrectionary. The Chinese government learned its lesson from the 20th century revolutions where those two things mixed up. But we are seeing the development of a labour movement in China. There's no mistake in it.
What about these protests that are taking place now in France? And just to say overall, I think people in the United States have very little information about what happens in the rest of the world and how we're connected to the rest of the world. But you've got millions of people marching in the streets protesting the rising of the retirement age from, 60 to 62?
I mean, look, all over Europe, the social bargain that came with the formation of the European Union is now under question and under threat because these are heavily welfarised societies. The states are all deeply in debt, unlike you. They can't just print the money. The European Central Bank won't print the money, so they're going to have to balance their books in short order. So the attack is on pensions, and as we know, pensions are just deferred pay. It's like clawing back, in some cases, 20% of your pay. People are annoyed. Now, nation by nation, it's going to play out differently. In Spain, later this month, there's a general strike. It could be quite big. We've already seen the Greek general strikes. Here, however, I think we're talking about old labour movements that have been around for 200 years. That are not particularly setting on fire the young. And I think many people in Europe, when they look at these protests, their great worry, I mean, France, there were young and old on the streets, but the worry is the young don't see any future. They're not going to have a pension. They're not going to have much the same level of healthcare. They're going to work till they're 70. There's a quite clever game being played about the young lose out from the benefits accrued by the old. And that's going to be a rising story. I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes a big story here in parts of the workforce where you have still good benefits, good health care. it's the oldest trick in the book to say, well, play one off against the other.
Well, another way that one is being played off against the other in many of these countries is now over the issue of immigration.
Yep.
You have in Sweden and in Italy and even in Germany now, and France, huge anti-immigrant movements that are developing here in the United States. And in essence, immigration is the other side of international capital. It's international people being forced to move to be able to survive. How is this whole anti-immigrant trend feeding into potential fascist movements in many of these countries?
Well, the interesting thing is that the European right, most of the European right originated in the remnants of World War II fascism, but it's evolving. You'd have to say that it's evolving towards a kind of plebeian, often based on things like opposition to Islam rather than race itself, colour of skin. It certainly is there. I think that your news has been dominated by this whole issue of mosques. We have that in the UK. But I think the point about my book is to say we live in a global labour market. The labour market starts at our door and ends at a bus stop in the poorest city in China. That's the labour market. And I think organised labour has had a lot of trouble getting its head around this. They hate offshoring. The American unions don't like it. Fair enough. Then parts of the American population don't like the influx of migrants. But if you were to stand back and say what period of history we're living through the history of the globalization of labour. So one has to, in one's life, get used to it. My town I come from in Britain is unrecognisable demographically to what it was when I lived there in the 1980s. But when I was there in the 1980s, it was the same as it was in the 1900s when my granddad was there. The change we're going through is a one-time only change, I think. It's for everybody to decide what they think about that. But it's almost, I can't see it as stoppable. The country of Spain is short 10 million people. It won't have a pension system unless it gets 10 million more employees by the middle of this century. Where's it going to get them from?
Paul Mason, why are U.S. labor organizations, why unions are so vilified in the United States? I mean, you have the blaming of the demise of the auto industry by many on the pension plans, the health care funds of the United Auto Workers. You have the blaming of the education budget shortfalls on teachers' unions and their pay.
Look, I think you have to see both sides of this. I think whenever one finds the remains of a strong union way of life, one finds people who are grieving about the collapse of the social solidarity around them. I found this in Detroit. You find people who want to hang on to what they have. Now, I think that can sometimes lead to behaviour by unions that seems to people who have no rights or benefits as selfish. Now, I think that is where that debate begins. And I think in Britain, unions stick to what you've got. You hang on to what you hold. The episodes I cover historically in my book are when trade unions stepped out of that. William Dudley Hayward, Big Bill Hayward, the leader of the IWW in America, was the leader of white men in the Rocky Mountains. And they were very militant, and they could dictate to the bosses. They blew up everything they didn't like. The strike breakers, the biggest silver processor in the world. There's a lot of whiskey drunk. But then he just realised they weren't winning. And why weren't they winning? Because the Italian and Lebanese and Jewish migrants in the eastern cities were not organised. So this man who had already he'd lived his life, stepped out of that and said, I'm going to organise them. And I think that, all over the world, that is the choice facing the existing organised labour. You either stick to your bastions and what you already own and the great union halls and the banners and the old strikes you won 20 years ago, or you do what Hayward did and you rethink. Certainly, I've reported on this process of rethinking. It's something that's happened in the American unions. It's certainly happened in the UK unions. In the financial district of London, there are Somali and Brazilian migrants organising in the very exact place that the Jewish and Irish migrants were organised. I went up to them and said, did you know you're doing this? Do you even know about this? They didn't even know about strikes that happened 20 years ago. So I think the power of history helps educate us. And I mean, it's not a partisan history. It's a history that says, look, for employers who want to do the right thing, here also is the way that employer-worker bargains have worked in the past. There has been industrial democracy. believe it or not, in capitalist countries that didn't hold themselves to be that left-wing.
Your previous book, called Meltdown, can you talk about the issue of the United States and how it's used as a model despite the collapse? You talk about writing it on the train from New York to Washington as Lehman Brothers are going down.
Yeah. I mean, I lived through a very frenetic 2 weeks during the collapse of Lehman. I was outside Lehman on the day it collapsed, on the street, stood outside AIG trying to find out what's going on at the moment that went the next day. And what I think we have lived